Welcome to another edition of Fun Facts and History. Today, we will be discussing the Cold War. The aftermath of World War II shifted the global balance of power and created a bipolar world led by two competing superpowers, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, also known as the USSR. The global competition between these two superpowers, the conflicts between various nations representing the interests of these superpowers, and the diverse actions and inactions taken during this period is known as the Cold War. This brings us to our first fun fact of the day. Did you know that during the Cold War, the CIA and KGB used a sex tape to blackmail Indonesia's first president? Sukarno was a trustworthy leader who attracted financial and other backing from both the US and Russia. His well-known weakness, though, was women. The American and Russian intelligence teams were interested in this. The CIA created a pornographic video featuring President Sukarno during the Cold War. By sharing the footage, they tried to damage his reputation. As World War II came to an end in 1945, the leaders of the Big Three Allied powers, the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain, met in Potsdam, Germany, to hash out terms to conclude the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. The Potsdam talks were meant to forge a lasting peace, but within 18 months, a Cold War began that lasted more than 4 decades. It is called the Cold War because the two superpowers never directly engaged in combat. Instead, they increased their military capabilities, tried to expand their global influence, and undermined the other's way of life in the eyes of the world. While the United States believed in a capitalist system of free markets and multiple political parties, the Soviet Union was founded on a communist system controlled by a centralized state and a single political party. The Cold War came down to some basic differences between the worldviews of the United States and the Soviet Union. Communist societies believed in redistributing wealth, taking from the rich and giving to the poor, and promoted workers and state-run economies. These resulted in low unemployment rates but sometimes led to the unequal distribution of consumer goods. They also viewed organized religion as dangerous. The US capitalist system let free markets determine the production and distribution of goods, and promoted freedom of religion. This led to more productivity but often created massive income and economic inequalities. Both sides also used propaganda to paint a negative picture of their enemies. From 1945 until the collapse of the USSR in the 1990s, these two nations competed for global influence in the areas of military, economics, politics, and even culture. Time for another fun fact. Did you know that the term Cold War was made popular by a journalist? In 1945, after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this phrase became widely used. The phrase was coined by journalist George Orwell in an essay that examined the implications of the atom bomb for international affairs. He claimed in his essay that the conflict with its neighbors led to a persistent state of Cold War. Another journalist, Walter Lippmann, used the phrase and investigated its implications as people quickly chose sides in an ideological conflict between capitalism and communism. The USSR had borne the highest number of military and civilian casualties in the war, an estimated 24 million, while liberating huge swaths of Eastern Europe from Nazi control. Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, was dissatisfied with the post-war division of Europe, which he felt didn't fairly reflect his nation's contribution. As a result, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin wanted to expand its territory and build a buffer between the Soviet Union and Europe. He also wanted control in Central and Eastern European countries that the Soviets had helped liberate. This made Stalin quickly establish strong communist parties that took power in Central and Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc. They took orders from the USSR. Meanwhile in the US, diplomat George Kennan outlined the Soviet Union's growing distrust in the 1946 Long Telegram, as it is now known. Kennan forewarned that the USSR was unstable and illogical, and that it would not work with the West in the long run. As a result, Washington started to implement a containment strategy to stop the spread of Soviet ideology and influence. The United States soon had a chance to put its new approach to the test. When communist upheavals broke out in Greece and Turkey in 1947, Britain declared it would stop providing aid to both countries. The Truman Doctrine, the idea that the United States should support nations or people that are endangered by Soviet forces or communist insurrection, was established when President Harry Truman took advantage of the opportunity to petition Congress for funding to aid both nations. The United States gave more than $12 billion in aid to Western European countries that agreed to open trade. Another fun fact about the Cold War. Did you know that the CIA deployed the use of the shoelace code during the Cold War? The US developed their own ways of attaining information by using low-tech means. The CIA developed a complex code with different ways for their spies and informants to send messages based on how their shoes were tied. An agent might, in theory, swiftly and easily unlace their shoe up to a specific point, lace in a visible crossover, and then lace the remainder of the shoe as normal. Why was NATO created? The US wasn't alone in worrying about Stalin's push to extend Soviet influence westward to bring other states under communist rule. In 1948, the USSR backed a communist coup in Czechoslovakia, and launched a blockade of West Berlin, which had been divided into occupation zones controlled by communists in the east, and capitalists in the west. To demonstrate a united front, the US and its allies formed a transatlantic mutual defense alliance known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. On April 4, 1949, the US, Canada, Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the UK signed a treaty agreeing that an armed attack against one or more shall be considered an attack against them all. The USSR responded by creating a defensive alliance of its own. Signed in 1955, the Warsaw Pact included the Soviet Union and 7 satellite states, including Poland and East Germany, reinforcing the ideological and military barrier between Eastern and Western Europe that Winston Churchill had dubbed the Iron Curtain in a 1946 speech. This division caused the breaking of trade networks and splitting of communities between East and West. These economic divisions spread to separate military alliances in each zone. Travel and cultural exchange across the Iron Curtain became increasingly difficult. It separated previously connected communities and created new ones living either under a communist or capitalist system. Germany became a Cold War battleground. East and West Germany had separate governments and capital cities. Families were separated based solely on where the lines were drawn. The city of Berlin became a microcosm of the Cold War, with British, French, and Americans controlling West Berlin, while the Soviets controlled East Berlin. To prevent defections, the Communists built the Berlin Wall in 1961. It divided the city. They set up checkpoints to control border crossings. At some points, guards even had orders to kill unarmed East Germans seeking to cross illegally. The wall became the most important symbol of the Cold War. Fun fact: during the Cold War, the phrase, "In God we trust," was first employed. "In God we trust" was added to all US currency during the Cold War to represent America's anti-communist sentiments. To reinforce the notion that Soviets were atheists, the phrase, "Under God," was also added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. In the 1970s, the US dropped tens of thousands of Bibles into Romania as part of its anti-atheist campaigns. The Cold War heats up around the world. The Cold War started in Europe. From 1945 to 1953, the USSR expanded its influence by creating the Eastern Bloc across states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Stalin set up puppet communist governments that he could control. He repressed anyone who resisted. The United States likewise began to meddle in the affairs of foreign nations where it feared communist regimes would gain control. This became known as a policy of containment. In the 1950s, competition had spread to the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, with each side trying to establish control. The US and USSR engaged in an arms race, pouring trillions of dollars into accumulating nuclear arsenals. Both countries had missile defenses pointed at each other, and in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the countries closer to the brink than any other event in the Cold War. The US detected Soviet missile bases and arms in communist Cuba, just 90 miles south of Florida. Demanding they be removed, President John F. Kennedy declared that a strike on US territory would trigger an immediate nuclear strike on the USSR. The threat of imminent nuclear war hung over nearly 2 weeks of tense negotiations. Finally, the USSR agreed to dismantle its weapons facilities if the US pledged not to invade Cuba. The US had an advantage at the start of the arms race. But once the USSR built its own nuclear arsenal, the two sides were at a standoff over mutually assured destruction, MAD. The idea that if either side attacked, the other would retaliate, unleashing apocalyptic consequences for both parties. By the 1960s, the Cold War reached Africa. Many former colonies achieved independence from European empires, decolonization. These new nations sided with the Americans or Soviets to receive economic and military aid. Both superpowers supported dictatorships that came to power through violence and repressed their societies, all to gain an edge in the global Cold War. Some of the most important Cold War conflicts took place in Asia. Communists took power in China in 1949, and the Americans feared other countries would soon follow. In 1953, Korea had been divided into two zones, with a communist government in the north and an American-leaning government in the south. To contain the spread of communism to South Korea, the US sent troops. The Chinese responded by sending their own troops to the border. The war killed nearly 5 million people but ended in a stalemate, leaving a divided Korea that remains today. Perhaps no conflict illustrates the policy of containment better than Vietnam. Like Korea, Vietnam was divided into a communist North and pro-West South. To contain the communist North, the United States invaded in the 1960s. The Soviet Union sent money and weapons to the communist forces. By 1975, with the help of the Soviets and China, a small, poor nation defeated the strongest military superpower in the world. Over 58,000 Americans died in the conflict. The war divided Americans who were for or against the war. After the Vietnam War, Cold War tension briefly decreased. The Americans' defeat in Vietnam, the threat of nuclear war, and new Soviet leadership led to open discussions between the sides. But much like the Americans had in Vietnam, the USSR intervened in Afghanistan in the 1980s. It wanted to ensure the victory of a communist-leaning group and sent troops to assist them. Just as North Vietnam received aid and military assistance from the USSR, the United States backed Soviet enemies in Afghanistan with money and weapons. Ultimately, the USSR was equally unsuccessful, and US-backed forces emerged victorious. After much infighting, Islamic extremists called the Taliban claimed power in the region, thanks to American aid. The US and Soviet Union also jockeyed to prove technological dominance in a 20-year space race. The Soviet Union scored first with the 1957 launch of Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, while the US was first to send a man to the moon in 1969. Only in the mid-1970s did the two nations begin to cooperate on joint missions. The end of the Cold War. The USSR could no longer keep up with US military spending. Meanwhile, economic problems in the Eastern Bloc meant that goods were in short supply. To keep citizens from revolting, the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, proposed reforms to stimulate communist economies. The economic reforms were known as perestroika, or restructuring. He also relaxed restrictions on freedom of expression, a policy called glasnost, or openness. The US and USSR forged a more open relationship, even brokering a nuclear treaty in 1987 that eliminated a class of particularly dangerous ground-launched missiles from the nation's arsenals. These reforms were too little too late. In 1989, the most iconic symbol of the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, which divided the German city, was torn down by Germans on both sides seeking to unify Germany. Similar waves of anti-communism spread throughout the Eastern Bloc. By 1991, the Soviet Union had lost most of its bloc to democratic revolutions, and the Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the USSR, opened his country to the West and instituted economic reforms that undercut institutions that relied on nationalized goods. In December 1991, the USSR was dissolved into separate nations. This brings us to the end of another edition of Fun Facts and History. Please share, like, subscribe and comment on our video to assist with boosting our presence with the YouTube algorithm. Thank you.